So, Mr. Knight, thank you very much for joining us.
Welcome to City Hall.
Thank you, and we are UCL Solar's Energy Project, and we're in City Hall today with you to hopefully discuss your view on the solar subsidy cuts, kind of climate change in general in light of the conference going on in Paris, and kind of where you see the future of renewable energies also in light of our recent nuclear investment. Why you think solar is an effective renewable energy, and for the UK in general, and why you think the government has put forward this idea to cut the subsidies by 87%.
Well, to start with, solar is an emerging industry. The technology is getting cheaper and cheaper as solar panels are generated in bigger and bigger quantities, and the standard of them are improving, they're becoming more efficient. And so they're becoming more and more competitive in terms of the price of electricity that they produce. So at the moment they have a feed-in tariff subsidy which makes them viable for people to install on their roofs. And if we wait a few years, then the cost coming down and the cost of electricity going up will mean that they're viable without a subsidy. The problem is if we withdraw the subsidy too soon, then we kill off the entire industry that's building up around installing solar panels on people's roofs. So the real question is not so much does the solar industry need a subsidy forever, because it clearly doesn't, and the solar industry will tell you that. But does it need a subsidy for a bit longer? Yes, it does.
And in regards to climate change and environment in general, and in light of the United Nations Climate Change Summit at the moment in Paris, how do you think government should be tackling this massive issue that is climate change, and where do you think the future of renewables is headed within that?
Well, clearly as a society and a global society, we have to put the fight against climate change at the top of our agenda. I think because we've had almost a decade of the developing world focusing on economic strife and trouble since the financial crisis of 2008, I think collectively the global community has taken its eye off the ball of climate change. And sadly we haven't got, in my view, the time frame to effectively ignore climate change for 10 years. We're in danger of having a missed decade in the fight against climate change unless we start to pick up on these issues and we start to invest heavily in renewables, in energy reduction measures. Here in London we haven't done nearly enough in terms of cutting energy consumption. Beyond that we've got to generate more from renewable sources, and we've got to cut our dependence on oil and fossil fuels. And if you look at some of the instability around the world in the Middle East, a lot of that is driven by oil money and the Western world's dependence on oil. It's not just about climate change, it's also about world stability. We've got to, I think, wean ourselves off oil and fossil fuels in order to safeguard our future.
Because it is, it's quite a daunting prospect when you kind of consider what needs to be done and how radical a change it kind of needs to be. So for the general public, what would you advise with steps that they could kind of take themselves if they were kind of a global earthling?
Well, I like to think it's quite a good idea to think about the world in 2030, 2050. What kind of world do we have to be living in if we're living within our energy means? And the reality is we're not going to be living in a low energy world, because people are still going to move around, they're still going to want to live in warm homes and all the rest of it. We've got to do all we can to reduce our energy consumption, but we've also, I think, got to decarbonise our energy power supplies, which means we need far more renewables. Yes, I think we probably do need nuclear as part of that mix as well. That's a controversial thing to say, but in my view, we need, I think, a combination of renewables and nuclear to ensure our energy security. And the highest priority has to be to get off fossil fuels. But if you look at the way we live our lives today, we heat our homes predominantly by gas. We drive around by petrol and diesel. These have got to go. We're going to have electric vehicles predominantly, and in the future, and we're going to be heating our homes electrically as well.
Okay, so you said yourself, potentially controversial, the nuclear, this idea. I think for some of the general public, this idea, especially in London, we only know it as the disasters of the rest of the world. They were kind of either unaware that we have our own nuclear power plants, or how potentially enormous they could be as a source of energy for us. Where do you stand on nuclear in light of the government's recent
Well,
investment?
nuclear is not new by any stretch of the imagination. You know, the pioneering work on nuclear power was done back in the 50s and 60s. So we've had nuclear power in this country for a long time. Other countries, in France, generate 75% of its electricity from nuclear power. That's 75% of its electricity which would otherwise undoubtedly be coming from oil and gas or coal if it wasn't for nuclear. So we know that nuclear has a huge capacity in terms of generating electricity. We know that it's virtually carbon free. And I think in a world in which we know the biggest threat is global warming, to if you like, ignore what we know is one source of carbon-free electricity, which we know works and we know has been around for a long time, I think wouldn't be sensible. But there's a lot more we can do with renewables as well. I mean, solar is one example of that. But inevitably in a country like the UK, what do you do on still days when we have cloud cover?
Yeah.
There's always going to be a need for something else as well. And I think nuclear is the obvious extra to put into that mix.